Tea was a quiet Tuesday morning at Windsor Castle, when Princess Charlotte, still just a young girl in the eyes of the world but already carrying the weight of 1,000 royal expectations, sat alone in her favorite corner of the East Garden. She had a small notebook resting on her knee, a pencil tucked behind her ear, and her eyes were not reading the clouds or thinking about polo or palace events. She was memorizing lines, real lines, from a real script that a film director in Los Angeles had personally sent to Kensington Palace just 2 weeks earlier. The story of how that script arrived at the palace was one that very few people inside royal circles were willing to talk about openly. A well-known Hollywood production company had been developing a big-budget historical drama, a sweeping story set across Europe, and the casting director, after watching a behind-the-scenes documentary about the British royal family, had reportedly told colleagues that Princess Charlotte had a natural screen presence that cannot be taught. The idea of approaching the palace was initially seen as nothing more than a bold, creative fantasy, the kind that Hollywood people entertain over lunch and forget by dinner. But somehow, someone within the production made the call, and somehow, the letter arrived. Charlotte had not been meant to see it. It was addressed to her parents, to Prince William and Princess Catherine, and it had gone through the usual channels of royal correspondence, screened, assessed, categorized. But in a rare moment of household miscommunication, the sealed envelope had ended up on Charlotte's study desk, alongside a stack of her schoolbooks. She had opened it without thinking, the way any curious 10-year-old would open something sitting in front of them. What she read inside changed something in her, quietly, permanently. The letter was respectful and thoughtful. It did not make wild promises. It explained the project with genuine warmth, outlined a role that would require only a limited period of filming, and made it clear that the offer was extended with full awareness of Charlotte's unique position in life. It spoke of her potential not as a celebrity child to be exploited, but as a young person with a gift that deserved a proper stage. Charlotte read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and kept it. For days after that, she said nothing to anyone. She went to her lessons, attended family dinners, smiled at the right moments during official appearances, and behaved in every way like the composed, well-mannered royal daughter she had always been raised to be. But inside, something was alive in her that had never been there before. She started watching old films in her room in the evenings. She started paying attention to the way actors moved their faces when they were pretending to feel something. She began to understand that what she had always been doing, standing at the right angle, smiling on cue, controlling her expressions during public events, was itself a kind of performance. And she had been brilliant at it her whole life, without anyone ever calling it talent. It was her younger brother Prince Louis who first noticed the change. Louis, sharp and spirited as always, had wandered into Charlotte's room one evening without knocking, something he did regularly and something Charlotte tolerated with older sister patience, and found her standing in front of her. Mirror? Speaking lines quietly to herself. He stood in the doorway watching for a full minute before she noticed him. When she did not shrink or feel embarrassed. She just looked at him steadily and said, "I'm practicing." Louis, being Louis, shrugged and asked if there was anything to eat, but later that night he mentioned it to their father. Prince William's reaction to this piece of information from his youngest son was calm on the outside, as it almost always was. He thanked Louis for telling him, ruffled his hair, and said goodnight. Then he sat for a long time in the quiet of his study, thinking. He knew about the letter. He and Catherine had discussed it carefully and had not yet reached a decision about how to respond. They had been giving themselves time, wanting to approach the question with care rather than with reflexive caution. Now that Charlotte had clearly already found the letter and was already doing something with the idea, the timeline for that careful conversation had suddenly shortened. What neither William nor Catherine had anticipated, and what no one in their immediate household had factored into any of this, was that the news would reach Buckingham Palace before they had the chance to address it themselves. Royal households are built on hierarchy, protocol, and communication chains that stretch in many directions at once. Someone in the system had passed the information along, not with malice, simply following the expected flow of information within the family structure. And that was how Queen Camilla came to know about the Hollywood letter before she had been formally told. The moment Camilla heard about it, the expression on her face, according to the staff member present in the room at the time, was not the warm, measured expression she wore for cameras and official portraits. It was something more complex, something that mixed genuine concern with a hint of alarm, and something else beneath both of those that was harder to name. She set down her morning cup of tea very slowly and very deliberately, and she said nothing for almost a full minute. Then she reached for her private phone and made a call. Nobody outside that room heard exactly what was said during that call, but the next morning, a senior member of the royal household staff was seen walking briskly through the corridor of the east wing of Windsor Castle, carrying a small envelope marked for Princess Charlotte's personal attention. The guard stationed at the corridor entrance, a man who had served the royal family for 11 years and prided himself on having seen everything, glanced at the name on the envelope, looked up at the aide, and for just a moment his composure slipped entirely. His eyes went wide, his breath caught, and in the startled silence of that long stone hallway, he said something out loud that he absolutely should not have said. And that was only the beginning. The aide who had been carrying that small envelope due to East Wing corridor was a woman named Margaret Holt, a calm and professional member of the royal household staff who had worked within the palace system for nearly 15 years. She was not easily rattled. She had delivered sensitive correspondence before, had walked through the palace during moments of intense private grief and public celebration alike, and had always maintained the kind of steady presence that made her invisible in the best possible way. But on that particular morning, the look on the guard's face when he saw the envelope had unsettled her more than she expected. She kept walking, nodded at him, and continued down the corridor. But the image stayed with her. That flash of raw shock on a man who was professionally trained never to show any reaction at all. The envelope she was carrying had come directly from Queen Camilla's office. Inside it was a handwritten letter, 2 pages long, addressed to Princess Charlotte personally. Camilla had written it herself, in her own hand, late the previous night. The letter was not formal. It was not a royal decree or an official position paper. It was written in the tone of someone who genuinely cared, someone reaching out across the complicated architecture of a royal family to speak directly to a young girl who might not yet understand the full shape of the world she had been born into. Camilla had not always been seen as a warm presence within the royal family's story. History had layered her image with complexity, with the shadow of things that had happened long before Charlotte was born. But in the years since she had become queen consort and then queen, she had quietly earned a different kind of reputation, as someone thoughtful, surprisingly candid, and capable of a rare emotional honesty that many people around the monarchy had long since buried under layers of protocol. The letter she had written to Charlotte was evidence of all 3 of those qualities. She had not tried to forbid anything. She had not invoked royal duty or institutional tradition or the weight of the crown. What she had done instead was tell Charlotte a story about herself. About a time, decades earlier, when Camilla had also stood at a crossroads between who the world expected her to be and who she quietly wanted to become. She had never spoken about that time publicly. The letter described it with careful honesty, the kind of honesty that costs something when you put it on paper, knowing someone else will hold it in their hands and read it. She wrote about the way ambition feels when it lives inside you and has no clear exit, how it hums at a frequency that only you can hear, how people around you can be completely unaware of it even when it is the loudest thing in the room. She told Charlotte that feeling something strongly did not automatically make it the right path forward, but that ignoring it entirely was also a kind of mistake, one that settled into a person slowly and stayed there for years. She said she was not writing to make Charlotte's decision for her. She was writing because she did not want Charlotte to make a decision without understanding what she might be choosing between. Margaret Holt reached Charlotte's door and knocked twice, softly. There was a brief pause, then the sound of footsteps, and then the door opened. Charlotte was still in her morning clothes, her dark hair tied back, a textbook open on the desk behind her. She looked at the envelope being held out to her with a slightly careful expression, the way young royals learn early to receive things. With composure, without rushing, giving nothing away before they have had time to look properly. She took the envelope. She looked at the handwriting on the front. Her expression shifted, just slightly, just enough for someone paying close attention to notice, and then she thanked Margaret quietly and closed the door. Margaret stood in the corridor for a moment, longer than she needed to, before turning and walking back the way she had come. Charlotte sat on the edge of her bed and opened the letter. She read it once, quickly, the way you read something when you are not sure what it is yet. Then she went back to the beginning and read it again, slowly, carefully, the way you read something that turns out to matter. By the time she reached the second page, her posture had changed. She was no longer sitting upright with the careful straightness of a girl raised in front of cameras. She had curled slightly inward, her feet tucked beneath her. The letter held close to her face the way you hold something when you are not just reading it, but actually absorbing it. Outside in the corridor, something else was happening entirely. 2 senior members of Prince William's personal staff had arrived at the East Wing, moving quickly. clearly in the middle of a conversation that had begun elsewhere and carried significant urgency with it. They had found the guard still at his post, still looking slightly less composed than usual, and one of them had asked him directly what had just been delivered to the princess. When he told them it was a letter from Queen Camilla's office, the reaction from William's staff member was sharp, immediate, and barely controlled. The information that Camilla had reached out directly to Charlotte, bypassing William and Catherine entirely, going around the parents and straight to their daughter, landed inside Kensington Palace like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples moved outward fast. By mid-morning, 3 separate conversations were happening simultaneously in different rooms of the same building, all of them about the same 10-year-old girl sitting quietly on her bed reading a letter, completely unaware that the world above her head had already begun to shift in ways that would take weeks to fully settle. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a royal guard stood in a stone hallway, remembering the moment he had seen the name on that envelope and had, just for one unguarded second, completely forgotten himself. Prince William found out about Camilla's letter at 10:30 in the morning while he was in the middle of a briefing about an upcoming state visit. The person who told him was his private secretary, who had been passed the information from a household coordinator, who had heard it from Margaret Holt herself. William's private secretary had the particular skill of delivering unwanted news with a face that gave no indication of how significant the news actually was, and so the words came out levelly, professionally, without drama. But William had grown up inside a world where the smallest moves between family members carried enormous consequences, and he understood immediately what he had just been told. He ended the briefing early, politely, with a kind of measured excuse that left his advisors no real room to push back. Then he walked to the far end of the room, stood for a moment by the tall window that looked out over the grounds, and called Catherine. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was not in a meeting. He told her quickly and clearly what he knew. There was a pause on her end, the kind that does not mean someone is struggling to understand, but rather is choosing very carefully how to respond. Then she said, "I'll come to you." They met in the small sitting room on the second floor that they used for private conversations, not the formal drawing rooms, not the official offices, but that quieter space that was just theirs. Catherine was already there when William arrived, sitting with a cup of tea she had not touched, her hands folded in her lap. They talked for a long time, not angrily, that was not their way, but with great seriousness, because the situation deserved it. The core of what troubled them was not the Hollywood offer itself, and it was not even the fact that Charlotte had found the letter. Children find things. That was ordinary. What was not ordinary was that Camilla had chosen to step into this space before William and Catherine had finished their own conversation as Charlotte's parents, before they had reached a position they could stand behind together. Camilla had moved first, and she had moved directly, past the parents, straight to the daughter. Whether it was done with love or with something else was almost beside the point. The effect was the same either way. William knew Camilla. He had known her most of his life, through all the complicated years, through the grief and the tension and the long, slow process of a family learning to live with its own history. He did not doubt that she cared about Charlotte. He did not even doubt that her letter had been written with genuine good intentions. What he doubted was her right, in this particular moment, to make a move this significant without speaking to him first. The monarchy ran on lines of authority and lines of respect, and those lines had just been crossed, quietly, in handwriting, on 2 pages of personal stationery. Meanwhile, Charlotte had finished reading Camilla's letter and had read it a 3rd time. She had then done something unexpected. She had gone to her desk, opened her notebook, and begun writing a response. Not sending it, not yet, just writing, the way people write when they are trying to understand what they think, by putting it outside of themselves and onto paper. She wrote about the film. She wrote about the feeling she got when she read those lines from the script. She wrote about being on the balcony of Buckingham Palace at official events, and how she always noticed the cameras, and how part of her did not recoil from them, but actually felt something almost like welcome. She wrote about being a princess, about what that word meant and what it cost and what it gave. She wrote for nearly 40 minutes without stopping, which was the longest she had ever written anything that was not a school assignment. When she finally put her pencil down, she looked at what she had produced and felt, for the first time in this whole strange chapter, something close to clarity. It was not a decision, but it was the honest shape of what she wanted, written out plainly in her own words, without anyone watching and without anyone to perform for. She folded those pages, put them in a different notebook from the one she used for school, and tucked it carefully beneath her mattress. That afternoon, she was expected to attend a small private luncheon with the family, one of those low-key gatherings that happened regularly, the kind that appeared in no official calendar but were in their own way as important as any formal event. William and Catherine would be there. King Charles would be there. And Queen Camilla would be there. Charlotte knew none of this was coincidental. She had grown up surrounded by adults who arranged things around each other without ever saying directly that they were doing so. She understood the subtext without needing it explained. She dressed carefully. She chose a simple dress, navy blue, and wore her hair down. She looked when she arrived at the lunch like any well-raised young girl attending a family meal. She greeted her grandfather with a kiss on his cheek and made him smile, which was always easy because Charles genuinely delighted in his grandchildren in a way that cut through all the formality. She sat beside her mother and was warm and talkative and gave away nothing of what was turning quietly inside her. Camilla arrived last, as she sometimes did. She took her seat across the table. For a moment before the conversation resumed around them, she and Charlotte looked at each other directly. It lasted only a second or two, the kind of look that most of the people at the table would have missed entirely. But both of them felt it, the small thread of understanding that had been spun between them by 2 pages of handwriting, pulling just slightly taut before the meal began, and the world arranged itself back into its usual shape around them. Somewhere outside, a member of staff who had been present in the corridor that morning walked past the dining room windows and glanced in, still carrying the expression of a man who had seen something he could not quite recover from. The luncheon ended the way most private royal gatherings ended, with hugs exchanged, with small jokes made at the right moments, with the comfortable ritual of family saying goodbye to family as if nothing larger than lunch had been shared. But the moment the cars pulled away and the doors at the palace closed behind the last guest, the careful architecture of the afternoon began to break down. William went directly to his father. It was not a scheduled meeting. He had simply asked to speak with him, and King Charles, who understood most that the unscheduled conversations were the ones that actually mattered, had cleared 30 minutes without asking for a reason. They met in Charles's private study, a warm, book-lined room that smelled of old paper and something faintly floral, with photographs arranged on every surface and a writing desk that was always covered in correspondence. Charles was already standing when William came in, which meant he had been expecting the energy that was about to enter the room. He gestured to the chairs by the fireplace and they sat, and William began to speak carefully, laying out what had happened in the order it had happened, keeping his tone measured, keeping the emotion that was underneath it all pushed just far enough down that it would not take over. Charles listened without interrupting. He had become, over many decades of being misunderstood and of being in the center of other people's crises, an extraordinarily patient listener. He did not rush to the end of a sentence or anticipate what the speaker was going to say. He waited. When William finished, there was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. Then Charles spoke. He did not defend Camilla by reflex, and he did not agree with William automatically either. What he did was something more useful. He offered William a view of the situation from a different angle. He talked about what it felt like to watch your children moving toward futures that you could not fully control, and he spoke from real experience, from the particular ache of having made decisions for a young William and a young Harry that could not now be unmade. He was honest about the mistakes that had lived inside his own best intentions. He said that Camilla's reaching out to Charlotte was likely coming from a place he understood well, the place where you see something happening and you feel the urgency of speaking before the door closes. William heard all of this. He sat with it. He was not entirely softened by it. A father's protective feeling does not dissolve in 30 minutes, but something in his posture shifted, slightly, in the way that happens when a person begins to understand that a situation is more complicated than the version they arrived with. By the end of the conversation, he had not changed his mind about the fact that Camilla should have spoken to him first, but he had gained something harder to name, a kind of peripheral vision around the whole situation that made it feel less like a border violation and more like something that deserved a proper conversation rather than a confrontation. Back at Kensington Palace, Charlotte had done something no one had prepared for. She had asked her mother directly, over tea, if she could read the Hollywood letter, not the letter from Camilla, the original letter from the production company, the one that had started all of this. Catherine had been quiet for a moment and then had asked Charlotte how she already knew to ask about it. Charlotte had looked at her mother with the particular expression she had, steady, clear-eyed, a little older than she should be, and had said simply that she had opened it by accident weeks ago, and that she had been waiting to talk about it properly ever since. The conversation that followed was the one that should have happened at the very beginning before Louis had mentioned it to William, before anyone had called Buckingham Palace, before Camilla had written her letter and Margaret Holt had walked it down the corridor. It was just a mother and her daughter sitting with cups of tea in a warm room, talking about ambition and identity and the difference between what you dream about and what your life is actually built to hold. Catherine spoke from her own experience, from the years before she became part of the royal family, when she was just a young woman with a future that had not yet been decided, and from the years after, when she had slowly learned how to build something real and personal inside the structure that surrounded her. She did not tell Charlotte that the Hollywood path was impossible. She did not tell her it was possible either. What she said was that Charlotte did not have to decide anything today, or this month, or even this year. She said that the most important thing right now was for Charlotte to keep knowing herself, to keep writing in that notebook, to keep paying attention to what genuinely excited her, to keep the door of her own inner world open rather than letting everyone else's opinions and reactions crowd it shut. Charlotte had listened to all of this with her whole self, the way children listen when an adult is saying something that they already half know and are relieved to finally hear said out loud. That evening, a story appeared in one of the British tabloids. It was small, just a paragraph buried at the bottom of a royal gossip column, and it said only that there had been unusual activity involving senior royals and a possible external proposal for one of the younger family members. It named no names, confirmed nothing, and speculated with the comfortable freedom of a publication that never had to be fully right. But inside the palace, that small paragraph produced a reaction that was entirely disproportionate to its size, because it meant someone had talked, someone inside the household, or close to it, had said something to someone outside of it. And the story, Charlotte's story, the one that was still raw and unresolved and fully private, had begun to move beyond the walls where it was supposed to stay. William saw the paragraph at 9 o'clock that night. He read it twice. Then he put the phone face down on the desk and sat with his hands folded and thought for a long time about what would happen next, and what would need to be done, and whether any part of this could still be contained before the world outside got hold of the full shape of it and pulled it apart entirely. And the days that followed the tabloid paragraph, the palace moved with the quiet speed that it always moved with when something needed to be contained. There were no public statements, no urgent press briefings, no visible signs of alarm. That was by design. The most effective management of a royal story was always silence delivered so confidently that it read as nothing having happened at all. Communications advisors from multiple households had brief conversations with the right editors. The paragraph did not grow into a larger piece. The doors held, but inside those doors, things were still moving. William had the conversation he needed to have with Camilla. It happened at Buckingham Palace in the early afternoon, and it was private. No staff in the room, no advisors hovering nearby. Camilla had arrived knowing what the meeting was about, which was itself a form of respect. She did not pretend to be surprised. She sat across from William in that careful way of hers and let him speak first, and William spoke honestly, which was ultimately the only way either of them knew how to do things when it genuinely mattered. He told her that he understood she cared about Charlotte. He told her that was not in question. What he needed her to understand was that he and Catherine were Charlotte's parents, and that the space in which they were working through this, carefully, thoughtfully, as a family, was a space that had to belong to them first. He was not asking her to be less involved in Charlotte's life. He was asking her to come to him before she went to his daughter. The difference between those two things was enormous. Camilla listened to all of it with the still attentiveness that she had learned over many years of complicated belonging was the most honest gift she could offer a conversation. When William finished, she nodded. Then she apologized. It was not an elaborate apology. It was short and direct and entirely genuine, which made it more powerful than a long one would have been. She also told him something that she had not told anyone else, and that she had only partially shared with Charlotte in the letter. She told him that she had heard from two separate sources, both connected in different ways to the British press, that someone was planning to run a story, not a small paragraph, but a full story, about Charlotte and the Hollywood offer. She had known about this the night before she wrote the letter, and part of why she had moved quickly, part of why she had gone directly to Charlotte rather than waiting for William and Catherine to lead, was because she was afraid that the story would appear before Charlotte had been properly prepared for it. She had not wanted Charlotte to read about her own dream in a newspaper before anyone who loved her had talked to her about it face to face. William sat with this for a long moment. He understood it. He did not entirely forgive it. The protective logic of it did not make the bypassing of him and Catherine any less real, but he understood it, and understanding something he had learned across a lifetime of being part of this family was often the only resolution available. Not agreement, not perfect reconciliation, just comprehension, just the ability to see the full shape of a thing, including the parts that were not yours. The Hollywood production company, meanwhile, had received no formal response from Kensington Palace and had quietly extended their offer deadline by another month, a move that people inside the production described as a gesture of goodwill and patience. The casting director had apparently told a colleague that she had worked with enough complicated situations to know when something was still genuinely in motion, and this felt to her like something that was. She was willing to wait. Charlotte did not know about any of the conversations that had happened around her. She knew about Camilla's letter. She knew about the talk with her mother. She had a sense, the way perceptive children always have a sense, that large things were happening in the spaces between the adults in her life. But she had no access to the details. What she did have was her notebook. She had kept writing in it every day since the letter arrived. Not the school notebook, the private one, the one beneath the mattress. She had filled 12 pages. She had written about what she wanted so many times and in so many different ways that the wanting itself had become familiar to her. A settled thing rather than a restless one, which was its own kind of growing up. On the last Friday of that month, William and Catherine sat down with Charlotte together. They had chosen the evening when the day's official requirements were done and the house was quiet. They told her clearly and directly what had happened. The letter, Camilla's involvement, the tabloid piece, all of it. They gave her the information she deserved as the person at the center of it. Charlotte listened to all of it with the same composure she had been trained to wear, but her parents, who knew her face better than anyone in the world, could see what was happening just underneath it. The processing, the absorbing, the quiet adjusting of internal maps. Then William told her something that surprised her. He told her they had spoken to the production company. Not to accept, not to decline, but to ask for more time and more information. He told her that nothing was decided, that they were not dismissing the offer, and that when she was older, not much older, just enough for all of them to have a clearer picture, this conversation would continue. Charlotte looked at him for a moment with an expression that was hard to read, and then, slowly, something in her face settled into relief. Not the relief of getting what she wanted, the relief of being taken seriously. Later that night, after the children were in bed, William stood by the window of his study and thought about the guard who had shouted in the corridor. The man who had, for one unguarded second, seen an envelope with his daughter's name on it in an unexpected context and had lost himself entirely. William understood that now more than he had before, because the whole of this long, strange, private episode had been exactly that, a series of people who loved Charlotte, each of them losing themselves for just a moment in the face of something they had not been prepared for, a queen who wrote when she should have waited, a father who protected when he should have listened first, a girl who dreamed in the quiet of her own room, not knowing that half the palace was rearranging itself around the shape of that dream. The guard had just been the only one honest enough to show it out loud. And maybe, William thought, turning from the window, that was the most human thing that had happened in any of it.